Good evening. I'm Terry McCarthy. I'm the president of the American Academy. Delighted to welcome you all to our Axel Springer lecture today on a very interesting subject, the laws of war and their Russian origins. You'll hear more from Peter on that later, but the idea of laws of war coming from Russia, I think, is very interesting given our experience with Little Green Men recently in a country not too far from here. Anyway, it's the Axel Springer lecture. Axel Springer funds 2 scholarships a year for us. We're very grateful for that. I'm particularly grateful that Jacques Schuster, who's the heads the political section at Die Welt, is with us. Thank you so much for coming, Jacques. Good to see you. And our speaker tonight, who is the Axel Springer Fellow, is Peter Holquist, who comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where he's the Ronald S. Lauder Endowed Term Associate Professor of History. And he was, before that, he was in Cornell for, I think, 9 years. Author of quite a well-known book, Making War, Forging Revolution, Russia's Continuum of Crisis, 1914 to 1921. And so he will be pursuing this project here while he's at the Academy on how the rules of law, and I guess what we now understand as things you can do even in terrible times, have some kind of regulation, and how that's originated with some Russians, which is a fascinating concept. And then when he's done with his lecture, we're very pleased to have Sönke Neitzel, who chairs the War Studies program at the University of Potsdam. And it's interesting because that's the only War Studies program in all of Germany. And Sönke chairs it, so what better man to come and ask Peter a few leading questions. And then afterwards, of course, we'll have a reception next door. But please welcome Peter, who's going to talk to us about the laws of war.
Thank you, Terry. It's my great honor to be the Axel Springer Fellow this spring term. I want to open by thanking the director, Terry McCarthy, for his leadership of this superb institution, the remarkable staff of the American Academy, who created an unparalleled environment for thinking, creating, working, the fellows of my class, my colleagues, for the lively intellectual life and stimulating discussions from breakfast to dinner and after-dinner drinks, the Axel Springer Foundation for making this fellowship possible, my colleague, Dr. Sönke Neitzel, for agreeing to be my interlocutor, and all of you for coming to this talk. I want to open by describing the project from which this is excerpted. This is the project I'm writing up while here this spring term. Essentially, it seeks to ask how European states moved from a customary law of nations, that is, the customs and usages of war. In war, everybody understood that there were some basic norms one adhered to turning these general customary norms into positive treaty law, international law. And in this story, Imperial Russia plays a curiously prominent role in trying to draft international acts that clarified these customary usages and practices. I'll go through these key moments in a moment, but that's the track I'll speak on today, this 1874 Brussels Conference. The second track, which I will not touch on today, asks whether these norms gained any traction, whether it was possible to turn these norms into actual conduct. And I do so by examining 3 cases of Russian military occupation: the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War, the conduct of Russian and other armies in the 1900-1901 Boxer Rebellion, when you have a nationalist movement that attacks both European powers and Christian missionaries, and finally Russian conduct in the First World War, the plans for occupying Eastern Prussia, Russian conduct in the occupation of Austrian Galicia and Bukovina. I gave a talk on that at the Schiller University in Jena on Monday, and then in Eastern Anatolia. Now, I hasten to add that I tell this story not as a starry-eyed idealist. I am not going to tell you the story that lawyers came down from the mount as Moses and made the world better. I do not celebrate codification as a triumph of humanitarianism. These laws did not either stop war or stop atrocities. My contention, though, is that these laws ended up shaping the parameters and practices of violence. I wanted this project to move beyond a sterile debate between idealists and realists, that it was good guys trying to do good it's the idealist position, or it was simply cynical and manipulative attempts to impose one's power interests on the other. Because, of course, both aspects were present in this process. Rather than this somewhat sterile debate, what I seek to show is how international law became part of the mental terrain of statesmen and of the military, how it became part of their mental furniture. Now, in discussing this Brussels conference, I want to lay out what the existing scholarship has to say about it in 3 points. One major question is, was the Russian government sincere in proposing this, and what were its motives? Second, there is a general consensus that at this conference, Imperial Russia and Imperial Germany made a united front against smaller states defending an arch-occupier position for draconian occupation. And finally, this conference is essentially portrayed as a contest or an arena for geopolitics, with various states seeking to impose their will and using international law simply as a weapon or tool or instrument to achieve that end. To make that argument, scholars have to accept or make the case that these actors knew what international law was and agreed on that concept. Now, I tell the story in 3 segments, and don't worry, I'm not going to give you all 3 segments today. That's 30 minutes. I'm going to focus actually only on the final component. The 3 component parts in how I tell the story are, first, the precedents and prehistory of this conference, and a portion of that story I have published as a small article in the fall 2018 issue of Berlin Journal. I then cover the course of the conference and explain how Imperial Germany and Imperial Russia began at the same starting point at the beginning of the conference, and the Russian government gradually evolved away from that position in its course. And finally, and I will try to focus on this today, the aftermath of the conference, when one can see how different understandings of international law were sketched out by the various players. In fact, I argue they did not understand international law in the same way. Now, I've asserted to you that Imperial Russia plays a great role in this process. Let me try to prove it. These are key moments in the codification of the laws of war. That is, where you try to turn what everybody understands as the customs and usages into a code of positive international law. You have the 1863 Libre Code, which is issued to U.S. forces in the field. You have the 1864 Geneva Convention. Then you have, and I'll talk about this in a minute, the 1868 Petersburg Declaration banning explosive bullets, the Brussels Conference, which I'll talk about today, a private initiative by the Institute for International Law, which basically takes the Brussels Conference as its foundation, the Hague Conference in 1899, the first peace conference, which produces the laws of land warfare, which is essentially a recapitulation of this. It basically reissues 1874. And then finally, it is the Imperial Russian government that both initiates and drafts the Allied Note during the First World War to the Ottoman government on the massacre of Armenians. So why is Imperial Russia doing this? I mean, first of all, there had been a long precedent, if we talk about law of war at sea, for Imperial Russia to play this role. In 1780, Catherine the Great had issued the Declaration of Armed Neutrality, will become the foundations of law of war at sea, ratified at the 1856 Paris Conference. There was Alexander I's quixotic attempts at disarmament and a holy alliance in the first part of the 19th century. You might be surprised at this role by Russia, but that's possibly because you're imagining Imperial Russia in its latest reactionary guise of the late 19th and early 20th century. This project emerges in the era of Russia's reformist Tsar Alexander II. And it's a reform era that is driven by defeat in war, Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, 1853-56. That defeat led Russian statesmen to a recognition that the need to embrace progress and reform. That undergirds this program. But why codifying laws of war? Now, my assertion here is that Imperial Russia had an affinity for this type of law, codified positive international law, because Imperial Russia, in terms of its understanding of laws, took part in an administrative law or Rechtsstaat tradition, one in which you ruled through law rather than being ruled by law. If you're not convinced by this list, let me give you another graphic demonstration of the role of Imperial Russia. It's the seating chart for the First Hague Peace Conference. And what you get, essentially, is the Russians on the dais looking down at everybody else. And this is because Imperial Russia convened the conference and then prepared all the materials for discussion afterwards. Okay, let's get to Brussels. Why Brussels in 1874? Well, I argue that there are three immediate precedents that caused this conference. The first is an earlier 1868 Russian initiative, the St. Petersburg Convention. The Russian army had developed exploding bullets. These are not dum-dum bullets, soft lead that expands upon contact. These were actual exploding bullets that were designed to blow up artillery caissons. And there was a fear that these would now be turned against actual human beings and animals, that this was inhumane. And Russia's reformist war minister proposed that Russia would forego use if everyone else would agree to do likewise. Most states responded willingly to this call, and in fact, Imperial Germany suggested that, why limit it to that? Let's discuss banning broader weapons technologies. Why limit it to exploding bullets? Everyone actually who comes to the conference agrees to that proposal, except for one country, Great Britain, which says, no, we're going to limit it exclusively to this one weapons technology that the Russians suggested. This produces actually a convention that bars exploding bullets under 400 grams, invoking the laws of humanity as its justification for doing so. The next a key catalyst is the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. This is important that it was actual conduct of war in the last quarter of the 19th century that drove efforts to codify international law. Here you had two indisputably civilized states, Imperial Germany and France, engaging in mutual recriminations that they violated the customs of war. The German military, by its lights, believed it had defeated the French forces in a 2-month span, fair and square, at Metz and Sedan. The problem is the French did not recognize that. And they continued the war after they had been well and truly defeated by engaging in guerrilla and insurgent warfare, the use of free shooters, Frankterror, that is, partisans and guerrillas, to which the German army responds by resorting to taking civilian hostages and using collective punishment. This war, among other things, produces the establishment of the Institut de Droit International in 1873, a direct reaction to charges that neither of those states observed the Geneva Convention. And that institution is one that legal scholar Martti Koskiniemi has termed the first professional organization for international law. That war also affected Russians. A young student of international law, having just defended his dissertation, a 27-year-old man, Fyodor Martins, is awarded a scholarship by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to study abroad in Europe for a year due to his good studies and his dissertation. He sets off, and at the end of his study tour, fortuitously happening in 1870, he ends up on the border of France and Germany just as the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. And while there, he collects all the information he can about how they're conducting warfare. Within 6 months of returning to Russia, in April 1872, this young man, 27-year-old Fyodor Martins, a very junior official in Russia's foreign ministry, writes a letter to Russia's reforming war minister, Dmitry Milyutin, proposing that Russia take the initiative in convening an international conference to develop a code of land warfare. Martins is cagey enough to invoke Milyutin's past role in the 1868 Petersburg Convention as the grounds for doing this. Now, it's one thing to decry this violence by these two armies, but how are you going to stop it? These men were facing a sociological change in how armies were constituted. Why a code? This is the era when states were moving away from professional standing armies to large civilian conscript armies. Another way of saying that is you're moving from armies of professionals to armies of amateurs. Professional soldiers serving for many years become acculturated to the law, to the customs and usages of war. Civilian conscripts serving under the colors for 2 to 3 years don't spend the time learning what those customs are, and therefore you need to teach them in the 2 to 3 years they're in the ranks. And that was Martin's argument in his letter to Miliutin, that we need to issue a code or handbook of the laws and customs of land warfare. Imperial Russia is just engaging in conscription at this time. Now, Martins insists that he, too, is not some starry-eyed idealist. He's not got some airy, very fuzzy-wuzzy ideas. This idea of a code, in fact, has been tried and tested, he says. And what he has in mind is this, the Libre Code, U.S. General Orders 100, which were issued in 1863 in the midst of the U.S. Civil War, a document more commonly known as the Libre Code. It's known as that because it was composed by a German emigre and university professor, one of Germany's great gifts to the United States, Francis Libre, a really fascinating figure. Libre continues his contact with the Germanophone world after he emigrates. He's a professor of political science and international law, first at South Carolina and then at Columbia University. He continues his contacts with the German world largely through his friendship with the Swiss legal scholar Johann Caspar Bluntschli, who moves to teach at German universities and will become an advisor first to the Prussian and then the German imperial government. This man Bluntschli impresses not only Libre. Bluntschli is also one of Martin's 2 inspirations in his study of international law. And on that study tour, which ends in 1870 at the French border, it begins with Martin sitting in at Heidelberg on Bluntschli's lectures. And within 4 years, these 2 men, professor and student, will meet again, but will meet again as equals over the conference table at Brussels. Now, some diplomats at the time, and many subsequent scholars, present this Brussels conference as one at which defenders of the arch-occupier position, that is, states with large standing armies and more likely to be occupying powers, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, faced off against smaller powers defending the rights of a population to resist occupation in the name of national defense. Now, the German and Russian delegations begin at the same point at the conference, but quickly diverge. Germany's position, I believe, grows out of two primary causes. The first is domestic. It's the Prussian experience of 1848, 1849, and an insistence that there must be a wall between the military and the civilian world. And this is catalytically reinforced by the German military experience in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Russia's views begin as identical at the conference because the Russian code was based explicitly and largely cribbed from, with acknowledgement, the Libre Code, almost article for article. And I remind you that was a code written during war for a civil war. And in the course of the conference, Russia will modify this decision. So in the spring of 1874, the Russian government approaches other European powers and proposes an international gathering to discuss codifying the laws of war. The Russians present a draft code that people can get their teeth into and say whether it works or not. That draft code is written by Fyodor Martins. Most governments understood the scope of the conference to be very narrow, like the earlier 1868 conference. It was a technical issue, and generally, therefore, sent military men as their delegates. And as with the 1868 Petersburg Project, it was the British who proved most reluctant. The British government issued instructions to their delegate that he should abstain from any discussion which may appear to him to extend to the general principles of international law, and then quickly issued these instructions to the delegate to all other countries attending the conference so they'd know Britain's position. And in line with these instructions, it's almost, the British delegate cuts an almost comic figure because he says no words at the conference, obeying these orders. What about the Russians? The Belgian government, in preparation for the conference, writes the Russians and say, okay, Russia, you want to talk about these laws of war. Share with us what guidelines you have for how your army is going to treat an occupied territory. This query prompts the Russian government to come to a remarkable admission, an act of self-reflection. The War Minister Milyutin observes that, this is striking, as regard questions of Russian army's relations to inhabitants of neutral or hostile territory occupied by right of war, our military legislation lacks any systematic treatise. And then he suggests that perhaps the young Professor Martens, I remind you, no military experience and a junior official in the foreign ministry, might be able to provide precise guidance as to whether there exist in the Russian language any such studies. Now, what's important for me about this is this shows that rather than using the conference to impose its ideas of war on other countries, as late as 1874, the Russian military did not have a systematic set of guidelines. In fact, this question causes them to draw one up. Rather, Imperial Russia was working out for itself, along with other powers, the general contours of the law of war in an age of changing technologies and people's wars. Now again, most countries chose to send military officials as their lead delegates. This preference for military men reflected the nature of the Russian proposal. That is, they were to get together and codify existing customs and usages of militaries and draft it up as a positive code. And if you're just going to discuss customs and usages, the greatest experts on these questions were, of course, military men. So the British dispatched Major General Horsford. The German government appoints as its lead delegate Major General Konstantin Bernhard von Voits-Retz, who had much experience in combat. In 1848, he had participated in the suppression of the Posen uprising. He had served as an army chief of staff in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and was a corps commander in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. So in at least two cases, 1848 and 1871, Voits-Retz had had experience with irregular warfare. But it's at this point that the German government introduces a new player to the gatherings. The German government, unlike all others, formally includes, for the first time, a legal scholar, Johann Caspar Bluntschli, professor at the University of Heidelberg, Swiss citizen, author of several books on international law and war, Francis Libre's friend and correspondent, and the inspiration for Fyodor Martens. Unlike the German government, which sent Bluntschli as a delegate, the Russian government dispatched only a military man and a diplomat. Russia's lead delegate was this diplomat, Baron Alexander Jomany, who had collaborated with Milyutin at that 1868 Petersburg conference banning bullets, and was Martens' patron within the foreign ministry. But the Russian government did not dispatch Fyodor Martens as a delegate. The man had come up with the idea of the conference, the man who prepared all the preparatory materials for the conference as part of its delegation. And the Russian government issued instructions to its two delegates, as did other powers. And in his instruction to the lead Russian delegate, Jomany, Milyutin specified what he thought the primary points of contention would be. Fundamentally, two. What are the rights of a population to engage in a levée en masse, or national defense? Can a population rise up against an invading army? And second, did individuals who participated in such an uprising qualify as legal combatants and therefore for POW status? Or were they war rebels? And as war rebels, were they liable for execution? He points out one of the most preeminent questions, perhaps the most fundamental. These are the Russian instructions to its delegates. To whom belongs the rights of a combatant in a case of a people's war, Война народная or Volkskrieg, when the population itself or part of it takes up arms? And these were the concerns going in. This is the conference that meets from late July to late August 1874. As the proceedings went on, we have these two sharp positions that emerge: small states defending the rights of a population to engage in national defense and asking for limits on an occupying army. And the other position, initially of Russia and Germany, saying, yes, occupied populations have certain rights, but they have those rights in return for obligations to obey the occupying army. And most fundamentally, Britain proved reluctant to sign any international act. Due to these disagreements, the conference failed to produce a ratified convention. All the countries basically signed the final protocols as a record of the deliberations, but it is not ratified. It nevertheless is important because it serves as the basis for several later efforts and would ultimately become the foundation of the 1899 Hague Conventions on Land Warfare. What's important in the course of this conference is that we have a new player. Hitherto, legal scholars had commented on treaties and conventions after the fact and in scholarly publications, but they'd not participated in making international law. They were not present at these gatherings. What is occurring is that the Brussels Project is unfolding at the precise moment that the discipline of international law itself is crystallizing as a discipline, not as an intellectual field, but as a discipline. Again, the historian of international law, Martti Koskiniemi, has argued that one should consider the emergence of international law as a discipline rather than as a subfield of law or philosophy, only with the founding of the journal Revue du droit international in 1869, or the establishment of the Institut de droit international in 1873 as the key moments in this crystallization. As the conference discussed how to assign its delegates, the idea was that basically soldiers would meet in one commission to discuss military issues, diplomats would meet in another commission to discuss political issues. It's at this point that Bluntschli makes his first intervention. He says, no, we need a third voice, that of the lawyer. One must hold, I quote him now, not only a diplomatic point of view or a military point of view, but also a legal point of view, a point of view which has its own independent value. That is, it's not simply an instrument of politics or warfare. And the conference approves this proposal. Not only is this a statement of principle, Bluntschli is actually wildly effective. He's wiping the floor with the other delegates. Within a week of the conference's opening, the two Russian delegates write frantically to St. Petersburg, and they say, Bluntschli is beating us up. Send us our own specialist. And the Russian government sends out Martens. And he appears and is introduced as a professor of international law at St. Petersburg University. So from this point forward, for better or for worse, lawyers were regular participants at such gatherings. If you just compare this, the Russian and German delegations are the only ones that have professors at this conference. When you reconvene in 1899 at The Hague, every major delegation has a professional legal scholar, except for one, Great Britain. I'm going to just briefly go. As I said, what essentially happens is that the Russian government evolves away from its initial position, largely because the Russians invoke their own past heritage in the 1812 war, which is a lionized moment of resistance using guerrillas and partisans. And that 1812 experience is not directly remembered by Russians, but is a lionized moment in the aftermath of defeat in the Crimean War. All right. Let's get to the aftermaths of the conference. And I want to basically trace two things, Russia versus Great Britain and Russia versus Imperial Germany in their views of law. Again, because of differences between the delegations at Brussels, the conference did not ratify a final draft. The Russian government, however, saw this final draft not as an end, but as a new beginning. Less than a month after the conference's conclusion, and it exasperated other governments no end, all of a sudden the Russians are sending out another circular. The Russians sent out the draft code and asked European governments to comment on it and let us know if there are things we can do to improve it. These discussions will go on for more than 2 years and would end only in the middle of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78. But these negotiations indicate how these states viewed law. Now, the Russian proposal to continue the work begun at Brussels had led to a pointed exchange between the Russian and British governments over the very nature of international law. Now, we know that the British government had been suspicious of the 1868 conference and of the 1874 Brussels conference. So it came as no surprise that the British government opposed any further development of this draft code. In response to the Russian invitation to continue consultations on the code, in January 1875, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Derby, issued a note to the Russian government declining further participation, and once again circulates this note to everyone else who was invited. So this is a public document. Now, this note observes that although Britain had agreed to attend the Brussels conference, the British government was not at all convinced of the practical necessity for such a scheme for the guidance of military commanders in the field. Further, Her Majesty's government were firmly determined not to enter into any discussions of the rules of international law by which the relations of belligerents are guided or undertake any new obligations. Darby continues, the attitude of reserve which Her Majesty's government had held towards this conference and the caution of the British delegate was fully justified. Instead of mere rules for the guidance of military commanders based on usage, which a general understanding could be shown to be desirable in the interest of humanity, the articles of the Brussels project were seen to contain or to imply numerous innovations for which no practical necessity was proved to exist, and the result of which, if adopted, would have been greatly to the advantage of land powers. Thus, the British government repudiated the project for altering the principles of international law upon which the British government has hitherto acted. The British government then feared that the Russian plan was not codifying existing usages and customs, but, it charged, the Brussels Conference was legislating new positive laws from on high. Now, the Russians get to respond to this. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs issues its understanding, laying out a defense both of the Brussels program specifically and of Russia's understanding of international law generally. Russia's Chancellor and Foreign Minister, Prince Gorchakov, said that this debate is about the fundamental nature of international law. The project of the Russian government, he wrote, on the laws and customs of war in no way contemplates the introduction of any new principles of international law. There does not exist, strictly speaking, any positive international law. There's a law of nations, customary law, more or less tacitly admitted, and of which some parts have acquired the force of law by means of formal treaties. Equally, jurists have, upon their own authority, laid down maxims founded upon experience, morality, public interest. These maxims have by degrees passed into custom. Some have even become precisely stated and rendered into binding treaties and become positive law. So whereas Darby had expressed fear that a positive code would restrict the defender's right to defense, their ability to exercise fully the rights to self-defense, Gorchakov replied that if you don't have a code, it'll be that much worse for the occupied population because there will be absolutely no limits on what an occupying army could do. And in conclusion, and this was a key hook, Gorchakov said that he welcomed Lord Darby's statement that Britain would continue to hold by the principles of international law on which the British government had up till now regulated its acts. But Gorchakov then continues, if this is so, it would be desirable for the British government to complete the thought by declaring what those principles actually are. Rather than a vague promise to uphold its understandings of international law, Gorchakov asked Britain to specify what those understandings actually were. What are, in short, the acts of war in the past by which one might judge how the British government intends to practice war in the future? The correspondence ends here. This riposte had no effect at the time, but it has an important afterlife. In preparatory work for the 1899 Hague Conference, British officials, in internal correspondence among themselves, find that Gorchakov's criticism was valid. They had never provided any guidelines of how the British had acted in the past. And partly as a consequence of this, the British position at the Hague Conference would be markedly different. So, drawing on a common law tradition, the British government was consistent and certainly sincere in its suspicion of an international body of delegates seeking to legislate from on high positive international law. The Russians, for their part, agreed that such conferences could not and should not legislate positive law. They insisted, however, that their efforts were made mainly tidying up and collating what had been existing usages and practice. Now, Britain's firm refusal to participate in further efforts ended any immediate plans for a conference to discuss revisions. The Russian government continued to circulate drafts to other governments to see if they could move the ball forward. This will go on for 2 more years. And in this correspondence, they have a number of heated exchanges with the Imperial German government. Now remember, the Imperial German government had proved very receptive to the Russian government's 1868 initiative on new technologies. They, in fact, wanted to make it broader. At Brussels in 1874, the German delegation, far more so than the British, proved willing to pursue a code of land warfare. but insisted that it scrupulously distinguish between civilians and combatants. The disagreement between the Russians and Germans was not over the nature of international law. That's what the British and Russians disagreed on. The Russians and the Germans agreed on that. What they disagreed on was the particulars about how to apply that accepted international law in cases of war. Following the conference, the German government, again unlike the British, was willing to continue working with the Russians to develop this draft code. But in doing so, the German government sought to place ever more stringent restrictions on a civilian population's right to resist an occupying army. Indeed, more stringent restrictions than its delegates had championed at the conference. In two waves of correspondence in 1875 and again in 1877, the German position was consistent. Regarding Article 9 of the Brussels Draft Code, which concerns whether militias enjoy protection as legitimate combatants, the German government indicated that while militias could be permitted, they should be subject to proper government control and must serve under a standing officer authorized by that government. In short, they must be under that government's direct and immediate formal chain of command. These guidelines correspond to German military directives of 1870-71, and by these directives, Franc-Tireur did not qualify as combatants but as war rebels and could be executed. And the German government wished to suppress entirely the Brussels Conference's Article 10, which granted the status of a combatant to a population which rose up against an invading army. And failing that, the Germans said, if you don't do away with it, what we insist is that any such uprising take the form of an organized militia, again under the command of a standing officer, and further that such formation should be permitted only if they were formed in the first 8 days after the declaration of hostilities. Now, the Russian government replies, and it warns the German, and it's doing so in the middle of a war with the Ottoman Empire. And the Russians say that we cannot revise those two articles. We're going to stick with them. In particular, they objected to the proposed German revisions to Article 10 of the 1874 Code concerning a spontaneous rising of a population. The Russians found the German demand that any such defense be organized in the first 8 days to be unrealistic. At the opening of hostilities, no one could predict what the future field of operations would be, and thus it would be impossible to designate regions for a levée en masse in advance. More generally, other powers, especially the small states, would reject any such restriction on a right they considered inviolable, self-defense. And finally, the Russian note continued, in Russia, the Russian government confronted a public sympathies for this position based on national traditions, meaning the 1812 experience. So in the midst of a major war with Turkey and in secret correspondence with the German imperial government, the Russian government stoutly defended the concessions achieved at Brussels for the rights of a population to defend its country. And I conclude here. My talk has emphasized a specific conjuncture at which this conference took place. Russia had a rich past tradition of engaging in multilateral action, going back to Catherine the Great and through Alexander I. And there were three immediate precipitants for the Brussels Conference: the 1863 Libre Code, the 1868 St. Petersburg Convention, and the 1871 Franco-Prussian War. This Russian effort to codify the laws of war then catalytically intersects with the emergence of a new discipline, the discipline of international law, with its new structures, the Revue de droit international and the Institut de droit international, in which both Martens and Bluntschli are key players. The deliberations at Brussels, I think, also demonstrate very clearly that the laws and customs of war emerged not from abstract and philosophical musings, but rather in response to the actual conduct of war. First, the use of guerrillas and irregulars in the U.S. Civil War, producing the Libre Code, and then Franc-Tireur and German reprisals in the Franco-Prussian War, leading to 1874. Many contemporary studies of international law present the 19th century gatherings as attempts by one or the other power to impose their view upon others in some geopolitical wrestling match. Reading both the delegation's internal correspondence as well as discussions contained in the protocols, it seems clear to me that these statesmen and military men were in fact wrestling with what were real intellectual, legal, and military dilemmas. In short, international law at this moment was not simply an arena of great power competition, but rather a rich and varied terrain of debate. And to pursue this, I suggest that you need to engage in a deep reading of these texts beyond the conference protocols and published text records to come to an understanding of this as really an attempt to wrestle with the nature of what is law. I finish there, and I turn it over to my colleague, Sanka Neitzel, for a conversation.
I've already learned a lot from you, from your articles and from your books. And I have now the privilege to deep into the topic and can ask you whatever I want to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
So you have really unfolded the British position, the German position, and the Russian position. And if it comes to international law, one always asks oneself, is there a categorical difference among the great powers? Because this kind of international law thing is sometimes a blame game.
Mm-hmm.
That, okay, these are the goodies and these are the baddies, and to a degree. And because I ask myself, obviously, when you have really clearly made the point that they have different views, mm-hmm. different interests, and of course, national states have different historical experiences. They are in a different geographical position. But we tend, in these days, 21st century, argue with morale and morality somehow, mm-hmm. and then good and bad. And would you see really a categorical difference of these three great powers, or would you argue, well, they are driven by their geographical position, their historical experiences? Russia mm-hmm. has, of course, the experience of the 1912 experience of Napoleon, and of course, it's in their mind. The first great patriotic war, and of course, therefore, they want to defend their own country. They possibly perceive Germany as a threat. And the Germans have their own experience, and the British, because they are the world power, and they don't want to have any regulations whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Right, but is that really a categorical difference, or would you think, well, in the end, they have their own frame of reference, and they are among their own interests in the end?
Thank you for this question. It's one that I've thought a good deal about. And you're right to point to it, because it is one of the areas that I am dissatisfied with the existing scholarly literature, which, as you point out, tends very much to flatten out and reduce positions on what law is and how to apply the law of war to generic national positions. So there's a Belgian position, there's a German position, there's a British position, and there's a Russian position. So the first thing I think I want to insist on is capturing the variety and diversity of legal thinking within each of those national cultures. Let me give you...
Is there a national culture?
Well...
Could we even say there's a Russian at the end of the day with all varieties?
A good question. I use Martens as my battering ram to demonstrate the significance of international law. He plays a major role at a number of international conferences. He drafts a lot of things. He, frankly, is not the most interesting mind among Russia's legal thinkers. He is an arriviste. He is a man who is low-born and has to try to make it in a status-conscious society, and that really scars him. He's kind of very boring in his desire for recognition. I could contrast him to another figure, and he's very interested in using law as an instrument for making state power harnessed to the ends of human beings and society, but also so that the state operates more efficiently. He's one who really believes that law is an instrument of state rule, entirely within this administrative law, Rechtsstaat tradition. Yeah. So he's chair of international law at St. Petersburg University. Not surprisingly, St. Petersburg is the site of the imperial government. If I gave you the chair of international law at Moscow University,
totally different.
It'd be a very different story. Yeah. He's a man named Count Komarovsky. He's from a different age. He's got, whereas Martens is very into, a meritocratic state service. Komarovsky is deeply religious. He's profoundly orthodox. He received no formal education until university. He was raised by his parents, and he believes in a type of international law that is based on natural law. In fact, he does not get involved in advancing Russian state projects, and becomes the founder of the Russian Peace Society. He's publishing all sorts of pamphlets about peace. He, frankly, is more, to me, he's not so much a man of the 20th century as a man of the 18th century in these outlooks. Let me give you another example. It's often said that the Belgians in particular champion this small state tradition, arguing for unlimited rights to self-defense. And that is certainly the position of the Belgian Foreign Ministry. And I can give you individual figures who passed the dossiers down, and that position will again be defended at Hague in 1899. The Russians pull a very neat trick in 1874, where they invoke, people have overlooked this because they take for granted that international law exists, but in 1874, the Russian delegation is the only delegation that in its arguments with other countries invokes this new body, the Institut de Droit International, representing the discipline of international law. One reason that the Russians do that is the article that they're citing is an article against the position of the Belgian government written by a Belgian legal scholar, Gustave Roland Jacquemin. And the whole point here is Gustave Roland Jacquemin is a champion of codification against this droit de gain, law of nations tradition. Or again,
would you then say that, okay, because we can't just, it doesn't make any sense that there's a Russian position, etc., etc., etc. Although I would think there's a German position, and you pointed that out, that I think in the German, what I've read about Germany and the German regulations and also the army regulations, they perceive, I think, an armed rebellion as unjust and that you can execute frontiersmen, and this is well into the Second World War. So, of course, there might be different in every country. There's not a unique position, but would you then go so far and make the argument there is no Russian position? Or would you then say, okay, there's a variety, I mean, we got that. But,
what I would say is that what becomes identified or reified as a country's national legal tradition is the position of its foreign ministry. Okay. So there are a whole bunch of British legal scholars who say codification is a great thing. Yeah. But the foreign ministry never employs these people. Yeah. They, in fact, don't bring lawyers.
And would you then say, okay, if it's very much the Foreign Office, possibly backed by some military, is there a categorical difference between these countries, or are they in the end driven by their historical experience, the geographical position, etc., etc., etc.? And that's, I mean, somehow understandable because they have a unique frame of reference. Or would you see any kind of major difference in arguing, or are they in the end all driven by their?
No, I think that there are cultures that emerge for the positions of these governments at conferences, and they're very identifiable. You point to Isabel Hull's work. I mean, when I was at Cornell, this project grew out of team teaching a course on World War I with her. I think she's right about the particular articles of the German war codes and the position that the German delegations take at these conferences. Yeah. What is striking to me, though, is that the Russian delegation doesn't really have problems with the German government because we might differ on these details, but our understanding of international law is more or less the same. It's the British that are way out and the Belgians that are way out in not wanting to have a positive international law. I'd say
so. The British are the bad guys, then.
The Russians certainly thought so.
Yeah, okay. Look, very clever answer.
The British position would be that the Russians are naive, that they're humanitarians who think that a law code, and they say this in their internal correspondence, that this law code is going to solve all the problems, that they're whistling up a tree. It must be said that the British have baked into the foreign ministry some long-standing views. One of them is a view that I think not Bluntschli, but German military commanders have, that the British have, and that the US has in the 19th century. And that is an argument that the most humane war is the war that is fought most ferociously because it will end the most quickly. That's the William Tecumseh Sherman argument, that the harder and more fiercely you wage the war, the quicker it will end. And in fact, the British come up with the position that the more you hurt enemy civilians, the more they'll shriek for the war to end. The other position that the British have, and you see this in 1868 and in 1899, is we've got a tiny army. We're the only state that does not embrace conscription. We've got a very tiny army that's fighting in colonial wars and possibly in European wars. We can't rely on the strength of our large armies. We need to rely
on the population. To a degree.
on the force multiplier of technology.
Okay.
That's why they explicitly they wear the black hat at the Hague conference because they say we need dum-dum bullets, and we need dum-dum bullets
for
because
the colonial wars,
because we have tiny armies, and the only way our tiny armies, there are two arguments, will be able to win is one, to terrify civilian populations, and two, use these specific technologies which we're good at against larger forces.
But why are the British so much for the right of the populations to defend themselves? I mean, they don't fear a German invasion also. But has that to do with, and if we are in a collision with a small country, these kind of uprisings might stop? I mean, the remembrance of the Napoleonic War, the Peninsular War. I mean, the Wellington was in coalition with Spanish guerrillas. Did this play a role? Was this the argument? Because you couldn't see why the British, they're fighting so many colonial wars, have a particular interest in for a population, for an uprising.
Right. I'd point to two factors in the British position on this. The first is the general British position on armies, which is that the playthings of sovereigns. Yeah. And they are just sympathetically more predisposed to side with the Swiss, the Dutch, and the Belgians, and their arguments that we don't want to have militarized states and societies.
Big armies.
Big armies are a bad thing. Big armies are the playthings of sovereigns. We are constitutionally opposed to that. Okay. And secondly, I think it's a question of balance of powers. You want to allow, as had happened in the Napoleonic Wars, states to be able to resist large standing armies. You want to imagine that Belgium or Holland or Switzerland or Spain would be able to risk and complicate those large invading armies led by kings to prevent their invasions. Yeah.
And I mean, the Russian position is also interesting because I mean, the Russians have their experience with their own colonial wars in the Middle East, in the Far East, in the Caucasus, quite brutal. And so is it the argument that they are, even when you pointed it that to the experience of the 1877-78 war, when they're in the middle of the war and they move away from the Germans and then say, okay, the population should have the right to resist. I mean, that's having the Russian experience and also the experience of using the army against the peasants isn't very interesting point I would have expected. So wasn't there an argument from the Russian army say, look, when if we say this, what about our internal colonial wars against the Caucasus tribes, etc., etc., etc.? Or didn't they also fear, I mean, insurrections by the Ottomans and by Balkan tribes, etc.?
I'd say too.
And it's very nasty if you're an army and then you have this kind of counterinsurgency warfare. So I'm not aware that anyone from official armies like this kind of warfare.
They did not.
Yeah, even until the 21st century.
They did not. I would make 2 points. First of all, the Russians are in an unusually favorable position when this particular conjuncture comes around. Because the last war that they can reflect on was actually defeat, and they can repudiate. Yeah. And it was, in fact, such a defeat that they've totally revamped and revised their socio-political order, emancipation of the serfs. They're just about to introduce conscription for the first time, as opposed to the serf army. They are turning over a new leaf and saying, all of that doesn't affect us anymore. We're in a new world. And when they reflect back on Russian military experience, they lionize and idealize 1812. And I think for Germany what happens is 1848-49 obliterates 1813. Yeah. You ask, and you're absolutely right to ask about colonial warfare. These are laws for wars
with proper states.
With civilized states. It's notable that at the Brussels conference, unlike The Hague, this discussion was limited only to European states. One of the classic questions I get when I address Russianists is, you're telling such a nice, happy story. But what about the conquest of Central Asia and the massacres of Göbekli? Yeah. Which certainly, this is a massacre in the Russian conquest of Central Asia, led by General Skobeliev, very consciously. And that's entirely right. I mean, the idea is that the laws of war apply only in cases where they're reciprocal and in cases where it's actual warfare. And the argument of these societies are not actually engaged in warfare which exists between sovereign states. Let me qualify that, though. I mean, that observation is entirely true and is often invoked for colonial warfare. Let me give you a counterexample. The point of reference for everybody discussing laws of war in Europe were the Napoleonic Wars and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Just as with colonial warfare, there is one event in the Franco-Prussian War that is never discussed in terms of the law of war, and that's Bloody Week. That's when the Versailles army goes in and massacres the communards. Over 10,000 people are shot in a week, but that is an army putting down its own insurgent population. Laws of war don't apply there. Just as in colonial, there is no, in all of the literature I've seen on law of war, there is no discussion of the Versailles army massacring its own subjects.
The Germans discussed that in their Militär Wochenblatt, and they are quite surprised about that. But in the end, they're quite positive because then we don't have to fight them. So I think it's a very cynical debate as far as I can get it. So I mean, I come to an end for my time here. But what is somehow the penetration depth of all that? And when we could think that if we want to explain atrocities, then I would always suggest an ideal triangle of, say, that we have dispositions of military and parts of the laws of war can be parts of dispositions. We have, of course, the orders given, you should do this and that. And this is very much the situational factors which are so strong now in sociology. So, and of course we can discuss all what you've researched. What is the impact then, on the orders given in the wars which followed, and also what is the impact on dispositions of general staff officers. I mean, they possibly see in colonial warfare they have a different frame of reference, but somehow, I mean, they don't have the legal books with them, but somehow I think they have a more emotional perception of what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. And would you think that this was all for the paper bin in the end, and this is an academic discussion, or would you make the argument, even if we go into the First World War, I mean, there are a lot of atrocities, but there is somehow a frame of reference which you can date back to the Brussels conference, or is it all in vain?
No, look, this is the $1 million question, right?
You should answer that.
No, and you're exactly asking me to jump from track 1 to track 2 in terms of what is going on with conduct. You're entirely right about disposition, orders, and follow-through. What is very clear is that the Russian government and the Russian army works very hard to pump orders down the chain of command, indicating what the parameters are. And when you do the Russo-Turkish War, it's striking, which is the first war the Russian army fights as a conscript army, not as a serf army. It's an army that's going to have its officers leading conscript soldiers. The Russians, of course, know that the conscripts are illiterate, and so it places a great deal of responsibility on Russia's officer corps. So there's 1877-78 is a remarkable story for me because the Russians declare at the start of the war that they will observe unilaterally the unratified Brussels Convention. That no one else has to do it, no one else will do it, but we will bind ourselves to observing this. And they issued both in their military journal and as a separate freestanding excerpt a virtual catechism of the laws of war that gave insurgents in this upcoming war with the Ottomans greater protections than existed in the Brussels Code. There are concrete institutions that emerge. This is the first war, 1877-78, in which the Russians create a post to administer occupied territories, and that post is a civilian post as a result
But
of these.
this is also because they want to present themselves to the general public as a civilized country. I mean, it sometimes reminds me of the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, which they dealt with POWs very differently than the Second World War, for example, because also they are on the stage to a degree. Is that to a degree the same thing?
There's no doubt that there's a desire. I think the Russian Act in 1877-78 is less. There's a question of are they trying to grandstand as the Japanese did? My sense of what Russia is doing in invoking the Brussels Code is they're trying to convince people like the Germans and show that you can both wage war and win war while observing these guidelines. Certainly there's a performative aspect, but I believe, and this is the idealism-realism argument, that there was a real belief that you were engaged in a war against an uncivilized opponent. Remember, the Russo-Turkish War begins because of the Bulgarian atrocities. And it is our purpose for the population of Bulgaria to make a better land and a better set of laws. And in fact, the person they appoint, the civilian they appoint, is a guy who had experience in imposing land and legal reform in the Polish lands. Explicitly to do in Bulgaria what he had done in Poland.
And one last question, what is left from that in 1914? So because we have quite a huge time span, and when, as you said, when it's Alexander II, but which is not Nicholas II, so things have changed and imperialism, etc. So how much percent is left? This is the headline, 30% left.
No, my story, sadly, takes the arc of a tragedy, because in the second track where I discuss, Russian conduct, my sense is that what I'll lay out is that in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, Russia's conduct was attempted to uphold both the letter and spirit of these laws. Again, in the Boxer Rebellion, I think I can show that the Russian government and the Russian army tried to uphold the letter and spirit. There were court-martials of Russians for the conduct in China, which is amazing, for the treatment of Chinese subjects. And then you get the First World War. And for me, that is crucial because it's a major departure. And it's important to show I insist on the First World War as a rupture point because I can point to the fact that previous conduct, there had been an attempt to behave in a different manner. And there are a whole number of reasons, but it's very clear when the war begins, the Russian government decides that it's going to wage the war in a different way. And the First World War ends up being, and the worst case of occupation I study is the Russian occupation of Galicia and Bukovina. Not because the war goes on and makes the Russians brutal. The Russians issue these decrees at the very start of the war. There's a decision that this is going to be an existential, phenomenological war.
Right, that is a good point. Thank you. And now, okay, the gentleman in the middle, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holquist. My name is Jim Brown, and I'm a retired Army colonel, but serving currently at the U.S. Embassy. I was curious, Henry Dunant, his recording of the Battle of Solferino in 1859 led to the founding of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And I was curious, did the arc of those forces play a role as well in the development of law of land warfare at that time?
Excellent question. I mean, first of all, you see the role of public societies. I mean, Institute for International Law, the Red Cross Society. I would say no, for this reason. International law in the 19th century, international law of war in the 19th century went along two tracks. One was the NGO or Geneva track, which was Red Cross, Geneva Conventions. What is very telling is that as those public organizations tried to get states to sign on, they had to make the case to the states that it was in those states' interests. And if you look at what the ICRC and what the Geneva Conventions cover, they cover only combatants. They have nothing to say about how armies treat civilian populations. That side of the question was dealt entirely along the state track, which was Brussels, Hague. What I didn't get into here is that there was a conscious decision, not just by Russia, but by all the participants at Brussels, to exclude public organizations. This is going to repeat it at The Hague in 1899. So it's an even more interesting story, not that these converge and reinforce, but that they're happening in a sense simultaneously and dialectically.
The gentleman on the right.
I'm Barak Ember, Professor of Modern History, European History at the Freie Universität Berlin, Free University of Berlin. Thanks very much for your fascinating talk. It seems to me that the codification of international law proceeded through reactions to preceding wars, reactions to challenges that had emerged in preceding wars, usually immediately preceding wars. I was wondering, though, if and to what extent delegates to the conferences of the latter half of the 19th century, including the Brussels one, anticipated new challenges, and to what extent the development of the codification of international law was promoted by anticipating new challenges.
Well, it's an excellent question. I mean, your observation is certainly right that the codification is attempting to codify the past conduct of the last war. I think you can see some anticipatory steps, largely thinking of technologies. I mean, this is, I think, truer of The Hague. The Hague Conference essentially proceeds along three tracks. One is an attempt to get everybody to ratify the Geneva Conventions and their 1868 revision, as well as the 1874 Brussels Convention. That succeeds. The second track is an attempt at arms limitation, which fails, and also an attempt to bar new weapons technologies, throwing bombs from balloons, using gas. Those are imposed, but are obviously not observed once the First World War breaks out. And the third track, and what everyone believed was the most important track, was an attempt to impose a system of arbitration, which is the most contentious issue at the Hague Conference. It does produce a permanent tribunal, but one that is purely voluntary. But I think with the Hague in particular, you can see the argument that the burden of defense spending is getting so huge, and armaments are getting so destructive that, in a sense, we need anticipatorily to come up with mechanisms both to stop this technological development and to prevent war.
Right, the gentleman in the rear, to the left. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ulrich Blum. I'm a professor of economics, and I'm writing on economic warfare.
Oh.
And
next lecture.
What was stunning for me was that you were talking about perhaps a different let's say, philosophical background of different countries in terms of what they think war is. So if I take the word war, the Germans say Krieg, the Dutch say Oorlog, the French say Guerre, the Greeks say Polemos, and the Latins say, the Romans say Bellum. And these are all very, very different words with drastically different connotations. And in economics, we have the same thing. So if you take competition, it's something different than Konkurrenz. If you take Wettbewerb, that has betting. I'm trying to get on a bet. If I take the China, we made an analysis on the use of words in China that relate to competition. And in 2001, the hardest word that a Chinese can imagine for competition, which is Jingshang, is the word that pops up from 0 in the quotations of the newspapers to 100,000 and ever then stays, because it's World Trade Organization, inclusion in the World Trade Organization. So there is a sort of conceptual metaphor problem in there.
Right.
And did you ever come across the question whether people think that war is something entirely different in languages, and that's against the backdrop of philosophy, against the backdrop of culture, what they associate with that? Because if you go to France, la concurrence est quelque chose de complètement différent than what let's say an Italian thinks or an American thinks. So it might be that the difference that you articulated is deep-rooted in our national, let's say, of philosophies. Sie würden sagen, das ist bei Sombart, Wirtschaftsgesinnung. And maybe that it explain also the debate we had. Because I think the interesting thing about the Libre Code is that he tried to transfer something from a very German attitude of ordering things, getting them into a framework, and the American chief of command was so desperate what happened that he said, this is the guy who should organize this.
Right. Isn't war just about military killing? Or? Yeah. That would be a British approach. So.
It's more than mutual killing.
Yeah, of course.
No, your question is both very good and very interesting. In some senses, it is mitigated by the fact that the language everybody was using was the same language. Everybody's using French. In fact, all correspondence within the Russian foreign ministry is French. For me, actually, your question has a lot of meaning because this term humanities invoked, laws invoked. And if you know Martens, there are two communities that know Fyodor Martens. One are the people that do international law and diplomacy, international law. The second community are those that are diplomatic historians because he was assigned by the Russian foreign ministry to edit a 15-volume annotated series of Russia's treaties with foreign powers and was given the free run of the archives. That is a fascinating document for me, for the question that you asked, because of this. He was doing it at the exact moment that French was no longer, it's the same with Tolstoy's War and Peace, by the way, that you are moving from French being universally used within the Russian elite to Russian being the language of use. So this treaty set that he produces is like what in the United States are the Loeb classical editions, where if you study Latin on one side and you've got English on the other. Martin's treaty sets are amazing because they've got the French on one side and the Russian on the other. And for me, they're mind-blowing for the question that you asked. You get to know what Martin's term in Russian was for the French term humanité, for la guerre. You get to see, because he has to translate it himself. So it was mitigated by the fact that French is the universal language of these discussions, including by military men, and by the cosmopolitanism of these officials. I mentioned Russia's diplomatic delegate, Jomeny. Doesn't sound very Slavic, does it? His father, Alexander Jomeny, was a Napoleonic general who, until 1809, fought with the French forces until he went over to the Russians and was the main military thinker. He was more popular than Clausewitz. And
this could not be.
No.
You can't say this.
And Jomeny, the diplomat, was his son. So Milutin writes this letter where he's so angry at Jomeny because Jomeny does not know Russian.
Okay.
It's a different age in the 19th century.
So the gentleman hier vorne in der 4. Reihe.
Martin Aust from Bonn University's History Department. Thank you so much for your presentation, Peter, and thank you especially for highlighting Russia's contribution to the development of international law. I have a follow-up question to that. Have a look at whatever textbook on international law. One of the first paragraphs will be about the sources of international law. And basically to this day and age there are 3. And one of them is the commonly shared opinion on what international law says by international legal scholars. And it comes as no surprise that international legal scholars subscribe to that point of view. But what's interesting is that citation from Milutin in your presentation. When there comes an official question to the Russian government, Milutin is in charge of it, and he says, "Oh, we cannot answer it. Let's transfer it to a legal scholar." And that's a very interesting moment, a moment in which a politician buys that expertise by an international legal scholar. Do you have any more materials highlighting politicians accepting that point of view of the international legal scholars, that they are the sources of international law?
Right. Martin is, first of all, being too modest because he also has worked on the role of Imperial Russia in developing international law and has also done excellent work on this complicated individual that is Fyodor Martins. What is telling to me is Gorchakov's explanation that scholars come up with theories of law that are publicly useful and adhere to the principles of public conscience. But they become international law only when they're picked up as actual practice and then ratified in positive treaty law. There is a subset here to what's going on. I mentioned that set of treaties. At the time the Brussels Conference was being conceived, Martins was doing the volumes on Russo-Austrian relations in 1814, 1815, in the occupation of France. And he's pulling out all of the articles that deal with how you deal with Fraktur, that's the term that was used, and how you deal with an occupied population. And he writes that this is going to be valid today. So what Martins thought he was doing in presenting these things was not coming up with, ideas simply as pulling international law from the air. He gets this idea from Bluntschli and from Lorenz von Stein, that he is simply collecting together what the past customs and experience has been, and that's the new science of international law, presenting them to statesmen who can now use it. So he doesn't conceive of himself of coming up with, but simply presenting it in a sense in a very tidy, neat fashion.
The gentleman to the right. We still have time, that's good.
I'm Roche Nelle. I teach American students at the Free University European Studies program. Since you referred quite a few times to the British position, I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about the way the British conducted their war against the Boer War in 1898. I think that might be also fascinating. I don't know whether you've looked at it.
I have.
How much time do we have now?
Yes. What I was writing yesterday down in the pavilion was exactly on the Hague Conference, which is relevant. All of these guys at the Hague Conference apply warfare. So the Russian military delegate has literally come to the Hague Conference from being Russia's military observer at the Spanish-American War. And he comments about how the Spaniards had used recontación, the concentration camps, and their usages. The German military delegate at The Hague, goes off to the Boxer Rebellion and actually dies in the course of it, Schwarzkopf. The British military delegate at The Hague is the Director of Military Intelligence, who's got to rule on issues of whether the law of war applies to the Boer War. What's fascinating is this guy who is one of the comic villains in the history of international law and diplomacy, General Ardaw. And he's a villain because he's the guy that defends dum-dum bullets. That's the only thing he's known for. He needs to be known for something else. He is the man who single-handedly turns the tide and convinces the British government to sign on to a code of land warfare. Argues this against the government, the commander-in-chief, but not the war minister, and his own aide, chief of staff. And the position that Ardaw takes, now the Boers were not at the Hague Conference because the British wouldn't have attended if the Boer republics were there. And the Hague Conventions on Land Warfare hold only among signatories, right? So the British government comes to Ardaw and says, does this new treaty hold for our war with the Boers? And Ardaw's answer is fascinating. He says, we are not bound by treaty to uphold these Hague Conventions. However, the fact that we signed these conventions indicate that we think this is the parameter of the law of nations, of customary law. And he says we need to observe these rules. This then spirals. There's a whole, what's interesting is both the endorsement of concentration camps, blockhouses, war against civilians, and then its retrenchment by the British government. There is an actual fight in the British government where Ardaw takes this remarkable position. This is one case, again, that illustrates, I think, that the existence of these laws doesn't stop violence, and it doesn't stop atrocities. I can give you several cases from World War I where they shape how the Russian government does things, instrumentalizing the law of war, but knowing that that law of war exists and you have to jump through hoops in a certain way. And I would argue that there's a similar case with the British in the Boer War.
The gentleman in the rear, und dann kommen wir von hinten nach vorne. Erst nach hinten und dann kommen wir nach vorne hier an der rechten Seite.
Thank you. Robert Frau, I'm currently at the University of Potsdam. I am an international lawyer specializing in the laws of war.
Oh, super.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I've learned a lot, and it clearly again shows that it makes sense to view other disciplines as well. Because I always wondered what was before 1868, and your answer, or the British answer, that they didn't quite know what it was enlightening to me. I was reminded in your talk about current debates that we have in international humanitarian law today. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to recapitulate them. There's a lot in there, I think. And Martens is a very interesting person. Now, I have I think a brief question that might be out of the ambit of your talk. But now, in the 21st century, when states are talking about outlawing killer robots or lethal autonomous weapons or laws, as the brilliant abbreviation is, many scholars or non-governmental organizations bring up the Martens Clause in the 21st century. So it's almost 150 years old. From a legal perspective, I would say it's not relevant anymore. But nevertheless, it has an impact on current debates in the 21st century. And my question is, do you by any chance know if the Russian government today takes any pride in someone who had a big impact? Going you.
I'm going to, first of all, blow your mind. Martens didn't write the Martens Clause. I'm going to bracket that. What the Martens Clause essentially, if you follow sort of the deep history of it, what it does is and this grows exactly out of the debates, and I can show you it's the same people who are having this conversation over 30 years. It's Count Lambermont from Belgium, it's Van den Beer Portugal from Holland, it's Martens from Russia, and what the discussion for the Martens Clause, which I included in the slide up here, essentially says, yes, let's side with the Russians and the Germans on the point that let's specify where we can specify what customary law is as positive law. What the Martens Clause then does is it says, but let's also accept the position of Belgium and Great Britain and say in those areas where we've not positively indicated what law is, leave it within the penumbra of customary law. I can tell you most certainly that the Russian government is deeply proud of Fyodor Martens. It made it very easy for me to research in the archives of the Russian Foreign Ministry. They were very happy and eager to show me the diaries of Fyodor Martens and the Russian delegation at both Brussels and Hague. This as much for the institutional pride of Russia's Foreign Ministry as for their pride in Russia. In fact, immediately in the early 90s, the Russian Foreign Ministry reached out to certain scholars and let them know that Martens' diary existed so that they could use it in their accounts. And there's various ways in which Martens is treated, but he is revered, I think, overmuch. He's become a hagiographic figure, and the complicated sides to him are, in a sense, undertreated in these some of the hagiographic Russian treatments.
I think we can take two more questions. I think they're on the right-hand side, at least one, yeah? And Henrik will have then the final total. Oh, right.
I have the mic. Jennifer Allen, Yale University, but currently a fellow at the Academy. So I come at this, thank you for a lovely talk, Peter. I come at this not as a legal historian or an international historian, so I'm going to pull on a thread that's sort of tangential to your talk. But the codification of a law implies the existence of a body that can then adjudicate its violation. So I'm curious in what way, if at all, a discussion was part of these larger conversations about the creation of some kind of new international body to then adjudicate these new international laws. And then as sort of part two of this question, whether to that point or to the conflicts in general over the course of these discussions, in what way did different legal styles, we've talked about different national styles, different national cultures, but in what way did different legal techniques play into these disagreements? I'm thinking here of the various roles of a judge versus prosecution and defense versus a jury, if there is one. So in what way did that shape these discussions as well?
And we take the last question from Harik, and then you can answer that. Then we are at exactly.
Thank you. I'm Christian Rieck from the University of Potsdam. As you rightly say, in the 19th century, international law is written by the great powers, or at least the European powers. But something changes between Brussels and The Hague. And I'm not talking about Japan, but I'm talking about countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, but especially Brazil, that become contributors to international law and writers of international law in The Hague. So what changes? Why do these governments come into play?
Oh, my gosh. First of all, thank you for being such a wonderful audience. And thank you for your question. And we're neighbors down in this pavilion, and we talk a lot. This is wonderful. In terms of adjudicatory body, that is exactly the criticism the British skeptical officials in the Foreign Office make, that without any adjudicatory body, you can't enforce this. The Russian response is that the whole purpose of this process, and they insist this up and down, is we get up a model draft code that all governments sign on to. And the way it will be enforced is not internationally. Each country municipally will then issue that code as their code for conduct. So it will serve as a template that they will then use internally. Of course, Martin's writes, it would be wonderful if we had such a tribunal, but I think everybody in the Foreign Ministry and the War Office thinks this is never going to happen, and he realizes it's pie in the sky. But the sort of neat, elegant solution that the Russians come up for this is that all individual armies will issue these as their own individual codes. And in terms of different approaches, with prosecutors or judges, I really see it most fundamentally between administrative law and common law traditions, and the real British skepticism that a bunch of people getting together in a room can sit there and issue law, and the Russian belief that you can. I mean, there's a real faith that this is gonna work. In a weird way, I mean, despite the Russian autocracy, there was a real fetishization of law, and Richard Wortman has written about this. Fantastic question about the other players. There's for 1874. There's an unfortunate misunderstanding. There is a French attempt. It's actually an attempt of Dunant's organization to have a conference on treating issues of POWs in the Geneva Convention. They invited a bunch of states to come. That literally intersects accidentally with the Russian proposal. They invite actually countries from South America, which is very involved in the development of the law of war. Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil. You probably know this book by Arnulf Becker-Lorca about mestizo international law, which makes this case that they're very involved. And this Brussels conference says, no, it's a gathering of European states. We're the ones who've got the armies. It's up to us to decide. That totally changes with the Hague Conference. And what's amazing is not only the role of the South American states. First of all, the United States attends, which it did not. The United States was invited, but it was invited so late that it thought it was an insult and didn't come. But you have Siam, you have Persia, you have Japan, you have China. The idea is that any sovereign state attends. And so for all of the similarities in the code of the laws of war, the nature of the conference is a very different one. This Brussels conference is a conference of great European powers. It's concert diplomacy. What you have at The Hague now is incipient globalization. And by the way, I think that accounts in part for the more successful outcome. The circle of players has expanded, and instead of having sort of these two bedrock positions, you now have a cacophony of voices and can navigate among them in a way that there was no free space in 1874. But it's a fundamental difference of 1899, is that it is a global gathering.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we have 9:01, and it was a very rich, intellectually rich, also for the dinner, but intellectually rich evening. And I would like to thank you, Peter, for this wonderful presentation and for the discussion. You for the discussion, of course, for your participation. And there's still something to come, because we are invited by the American Academy for some kinds of drinks. I'm not aware of which kind of drinks, but
the right kind of drinks.
The right kind of drinks. And I would like you to follow us and to continue with the wonderful discussions. So thank you very much for coming again.
Thank you. Thank you.